Hey guys, what is up? My name is Morgan and I'm so excited to show you all the different ways that you can embellish your clothing with embroidery and Sashiko. So we are gonna go ahead and dive right in. We're gonna start with Sashiko. Sashiko is a traditionally Japanese art form that started in the Edo period in Japan and started as a way to just, mend your clothing, take the garments and the pieces of textiles that you already had and kind of make them better and last longer. But over time, it became its own full art form. So today we're gonna take the more decorative elements of Sashiko and put them on our shirt. So let's get started. Okay, so the tools that we have. We are gonna start by looking at our thread. Sashiko thread is gonna be a little different than embroidery floss. That might be what you have, and if that's all you have, that's awesome. But some things that make Sashiko thread special is it does have this super nice matteness to it. It also doesn't separate out. So if you look at these bottom of the thread, it's not like embroidery floss where it's made of a bunch of tiny little threads. It's just one solid piece of thread. So that's the thread that we'll be using today. Traditionally, Sashiko thread is white and it's stitched on an indigo background. The reason for that being that indigo dye was the most commonly accessible dye for northern Japan during the time. But today you can find all different kinds of dyes, all different types of colors of thread. So get creative with it. Don't feel tied to just doing the indigo and white, but that's what I'm gonna be doing today. So next after our thread, we have our marking tools. So if you look at my example, you'll see that I have all kinds of lines on my project to show me where I need to be stitching. These lines are going to give us a really good guide, and they also give our eye kind of a way to see what the finished product is going to look like. So that's what we have, but we need to find a way to mark that onto our fabric. So for that, I like to use a clear ruler. I like to just use something that's plastic, super easy to read. Sometimes I have a bigger ruler and a smaller ruler, depending on the project I'm working with. And you also want a marking tool. I like to use the Frixion pens because I like how they iron out whenever I'm done using them. But if you have a chalk pencil, a chalk pen, or a little piece of chalk, anything works, as long as it has a really fine tip. You'll see when I'm actually drawing my lines that it's nice to have a really fine tip to your marking tool because it makes it easier to see where your lines are. So you have your marking tool. You have your ruler, you have your thread. Finally, we're gonna look at our needle. So this is a Sashiko needle. You'll see that it's about the size of a regular embroidery needle. It has a decently large eye and it's a little longer. So now that we have all our tools, we are gonna get ready to go ahead and put our design onto our fabric. So I'm gonna just move that aside and I'm gonna get our essential shirt ready. If you like this shirt, we do actually have a class on it on the Top Stitch Makers website. It will take you all the way from the very, very beginnings of making this shirt through the end. So if you're interested, definitely check it out. For today, I'm gonna be doing my design on the back of the shirt just because I like having a little pop of design as you're walking away. So I am gonna kind of figure out where I wanna center this design. I think I wanna center it on the back top right here, kind of where the shoulders are. So from there, I am just gonna take my ruler. I like to make my design nice and perpendicular with my project. So sometimes I even give it a little foldy fold to figure out where the center of the garment is. Give myself a nice little line to base it off of. So once I've done that, I'm gonna unfold it, take it to the back, and you can see we have a little bitty crease right there that we can go off of. So to start, I am going to line my ruler up with that crease. And I'm just gonna make my first bold line. Note that if you're working on a darker fabric, you are gonna wanna use a really brightly colored marking tool so it's super easy to see. So that's the first line of our grid. From here, you can kind of decide how big you want your grid to be in your project. Traditionally, Sashiko is worked on a 1/4 inch grid, so it's pretty small and each stitch is the length of a 1/4 inch. But if you look on my project over here, I've done it on a larger grid. It kind of just depends on the project you're working on, so be flexible, but traditionally it is a 1/4 inch, so that's what I'm gonna do today. I am gonna just line it up all the way at the 1/4 inch mark, and I'm gonna make my second line. I like to start in the center and then go out on each side to kind of establish my grid, but you can really draw it however you want. There's no need to be super stiff with it. I just like to kind of go. And now this part, you'll see why I want my line to be nice and sharp. I don't want to be doing this with a dull pencil or pen or anything, because we are basing our next line off of where our last line was. So if you're working with a really dull pencil, it can get kind of muddy to figure out where you're trying to be. So I'm just going to go probably all the way across the length of the neckline with this. I'm going to try to make it a little wider than it is long. So this x-axis, I think it's the x-axis. It's been a while since I've taken a math class, but this x-axis is going to be a little wider. Some fun facts about Sashiko are that it has a lot of symbolism to the patterns. If you look up different patterns, they mean and represent different things. Usually they're things based on nature, but today there's tons of different patterns that are like teddy bears and like cartoon characters. So it's definitely taken a departure from what the traditional art form was, but still super cool and awesome. So I'm going to just keep on going with it. Cool, so now you'll see I've done one half of the lines, but if you look at it, you'll see it's kind of hard to see these lines, right? Because it's a really dark colored fabric, and this pin, while it's awesome, it's just not quite showing up as much as we want it to. So my friends behind the camera tell me to get something a little brighter, so that's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna grab one of these. It is a Clover chalk pen. It's super cool and nifty. It lets you create really, really thin lines of marking while using chalk, so you can just dust it away when you're done. I love this guy, and look how much brighter it is, which is nice. So you'll like being able to see it more. I like being able to see it more. My friends behind the camera will like being able to see it more. So that's what we're gonna do. So I'm just gonna do the same exact thing that I was doing, which is just making my little 1/4 inch lines. So this kind of shows you the different tools that you can use. You don't have to be locked into using one type of marking tool or one type of ruler for your whole project. I encourage you to play around with what works with you, or even just use what you have around the house. I mean, you do want these lines to be something that disappears after you're done with it, because the focus will be on the stitching, not on these lines that we're drawing. So don't go in with a Sharpie. I would not recommend that, but any sort of chalk or erasable marking tool is gonna be great. You're gonna do this grid situation or drawing out your pattern for almost every project you do. It won't always be a 1/4 inch like what we're doing today, but you always will give yourself some sort of guidance on your fabric before you start working, unless you're doing something like doing Sashiko on a quilt, which is a great use of Sashiko. It's where you use the stitching to kind of bind all your layers together. So you might use that on a quilt, and so for that you may not mark out every single line, but traditionally if you're going to be doing it on like a garment, or you're going to be doing something with like a pattern that goes up and down and sideways, you're going to want to make something like this. So I'm just going to keep on drawing my lines. You can see how easy this Clover marker is working, and how bright it is, which is super awesome for us. And there is one direction of it. You can see we have a nice vertical line going. Now we want to do our horizontal lines. Depending on the project you're working on, these may also be a 1/4 inch, or they may be a different size. The project that we're going to be doing today, we will be doing 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch. We are just doing a really simple hitamizashi pattern. Hitamizashi patterns are all geometric. It looks like just, you can either do all vertical lines, you can do lines that cross, or you can do pretty little stars like that. So you can kind of decide how intricate you want it to be. This is the pattern that we're doing, and this is from Jessica Marquez's book, Make and Mend. I think it is one of the best Sashiko books that you can possibly get. She has so much info in here. She gives you so many practical tips and tricks on how to do things. I think it's really easy and fun to look through, and it's also just beautiful. So 10 out of 10, recommend this book. It's what I always reference whenever I'm doing Sashiko, and it's where I got a lot of my ideas for my patterns. So she's a rock star. Go buy this book. It's awesome. It's great. So that's what we're going to be using today. So now I am just going to line up my ruler going the other way. I really want these stitches to be nice and perpendicular to the vertical lines I've already made. So when I lay my ruler down, I'm just going to lay it down and make sure that it looks at a nice like perpendicular T shape. And I'm going to draw my first line. For this one, I'm going to start at the bottom and then just go up instead of starting in the middle and going out, just to save a little time. But I'm going to do the same exact thing where I draw my first line, I line up my ruler, I draw my next line, and so on and so forth. So now I am going to keep on making my lines. I'm going to make it kind of go up the side curve of the neck. I think that's going to be fun. Something you can play around with doing Sashiko on a garment is making it conform and kind of play with the shape of the garment. You don't have to be stuck in doing just plain old squares and rectangles. You can really have it move with the shape of what you're doing. So I'm going to extend it like that. And now you can see I have my full grid going. You'll see I have my x-axis and my y-axis. So I have a good idea of where and what I'm going to be stitching. So now that we have our grid done and it looks awesome, we are going to get into stitching. So I'm just going to take my marking tools and set them aside. And I am going to grab our thread and our needle. So you'll see that I have my thread braided like this. I think it is a great way to organize my Sashiko thread. Your Sashiko thread will come kind of in a pack. How you get it to this is you just take it out of your pack, you unravel it, you cut one end, and you braid it, just like a summer camp friendship bracelet. If you don't want to do that, you can always organize it onto a bobbin or however you like to organize your threads, but I do like to have mine pre-cut because I think it's easier to grab and go. So that's how I have mine, but whatever works for you works. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab a piece of thread right off here at the top. I'm going to put my main braid aside and I'm going to thread up my needle. I like to lick it and just put it through the eye. Sashiko needles, their eye is perfectly sized for Sashiko thread. So threading your needle should be nice and easy every time. So now I'm going to pull it to where one side is longer than the other. I'm going to call this shorter side the tail and this longer side the working thread. The tail is just kind of there to secure our stitches. We're not going to tie any knots on it or anything. It's just kind of there to hold on. The working thread is what we're going to use to make all of our awesome stitches. Now, here's when you can proceed in one of two different ways. You can either tie a knot at the end of your Sashiko thread, so right there, close to the end, if you want. But in traditional Sashiko work, there are no knots on the back side. Instead, you do a couple stitches in and go backwards, just like you were doing a back stitch on a sewing machine. So I can demonstrate that here. But again, if you would rather just do a knot and that's what floats your boat, totally cool. Before we get into stitching too, there's a couple things to know about the order of stitching when it comes to Sashiko. Traditionally, you will always stitch your vertical lines first, then you'll do your horizontal lines, and then finally you'll do your diagonal lines. The reason for that being that it kind of breaks down the pattern. It makes it easier to see what you're stitching. It makes it easier to kind of figure out your pattern as you go. Also, maybe you're not using a grid. It lets you establish where your baseline stitches are first before you get into all the cool, awesome decorative stuff. So remember, it is always vertical, then horizontal, then diagonal. So I'm going to just start at this far end of the vertical. Something you may notice today is I'm not using a hoop. So if you've ever done embroidery or cross stitch before, you'll probably know that a hoop is kind of a necessity, but for Sashiko, we don't use one. The reason for that being it makes it a lot easier to get inside the garment and move your stitches around. Also because we need this fabric to be nice and loose so that we can move our needle to do our stitches super fast. So first I am gonna show you how to start your sashiko without tying any knots. I'm gonna bring my needle to the inside. I'm just gonna kind of grab it up like this. And I am going to do 1 stitch away. I'm starting it kind of in because we are gonna stagger our stitches today. So you'll see I don't have a knot, so it did just kind of pull itself all the way through. I usually do work with knots, but I wanted to give you guys a hint of like what is traditional and authentic with sashiko, because we got to kind of pay homage to its roots, and I want everybody to know kind of like the history. So one last time, I'm gonna go super slow to make sure. I haven't pulled my thread all the way through. I've just kind of have it partially with a little tail on the back. I'm gonna make a stitch that's a little smaller than my grid, just going backwards. So now all we have is just one kind of slightly shorter backward stitch, like that. And now to secure it, to make sure that it just doesn't pull through again, I'm gonna pull through from where I would want my stitch to end, right there. Pull partially through, like that. I'm just gonna check the back to make sure that I don't have any knots up in there. So we're gonna just check. And you'll see we don't. It looks nice and neat. I even caught the end of my thread on that tiny stitch that we made. So now I'm just gonna pull it to this side. And I am going to do a forward stitch and bring my needle down. So that I've basically gone over the same stitch twice, making the first one a little shorter so that then I could come in and make the second one longer. And that is how you secure your sashiko stitching without any knots on the back side. So from there, I am ready to start stitching. So now I'm gonna bring my needle up 1 block away, like that. And for this, I'm gonna get into the actual way that we sashiko stitch. So instead of bringing our needle down every single time and up every single time, we are gonna just skim our needle along the surface. So I am just going to take my needle, not pulling it all the way to the back. Instead, I'm just skimming it along the surface of the back. And I am basically like bringing it up and down so that you'll see there are multiple stitches loaded onto the needle at once. The reason why we do this is it makes it go super fast. It also gives you a good smooth stitching, and it makes your stitches look really nice and even, and it also keeps your needle on the right side of your fabric. That's important if you're gonna be stitching on something like a shirt sleeve or a pant leg where you don't have a ton of room on the inside of the garment. It's gonna give you a really nice ability to just stitch from one side. So it is why it is my favorite method. So again, I am just bringing my needle down and then up again. You'll notice I'm making my stitches the same length as my grid, so they're a nice 1/4 inch long. So I'm bringing it down and back up, down and back up. You don't have to load all of a row of stitching onto your needle at once. I like to usually do 3 or 4. And this, you might be realizing why it's nice to have a nice long needle, because it gives you the ability to load more stitches on at once. So I'm gonna come all the way up to here. I'm gonna pull my needle through the back side because you'll see this little square doesn't get stitched through. We're gonna leave that open. I'm gonna pull it through. So now the pattern that we're doing today, we are gonna stagger our stitching. So before I go to the second row, I'm just gonna pull these through, kind of make sure they're nice and even. There's no unintentional gathering or puckering on our fabric. We want it to just be nice and smooth. Something that you might have to get used to with sashiko stitching is there is no hoop, so you control your own tension. So you just wanna be mindful as you're stitching that you're not gathering or making any of your stitches too tight. It's nice and chill. So now I'm gonna come to my second vertical row. I'm gonna stagger my stitches by coming up here. I'm not gonna pull too tight when I'm going from this row to this row because we don't wanna create a pucker right here. So now I will just do the same exact thing of bringing my needle towards me. If you're stitching at home, you don't have to do this weird gymnastics of stitching towards yourself. I'm just doing it so that you can see a little better. Definitely, as you're stitching at home, get comfortable, hold the fabric in whichever way is the most comfortable for you. Sit back, relax. This stitching is easy, so let yourself enjoy it. Okay, so you see I have 2 rows now. I'm gonna finish it out, and I am going to just jump into doing all of my vertical rows. Okay, so now I've stitched about half of the vertical lines and I'm kind of running out of thread. So I'm going to show you 2 different ways to secure your thread when you are running out. So traditionally, as we talked about in Sashiko, you don't tie any knots. So if you were ready to change your thread and you didn't want to tie a knot, what you would do is I would just come, I've done this stitch and I've just gone down right there. I would just bring my needle up a few little fibers away from it. And I am gonna go backwards. You can go backwards once, you can go backwards twice. It's kind of up to you. It's just like if you were doing a back stitch on a sewing machine. You just wanna do a few backward stitches to really reinforce your thread. Now, if you don't wanna do this, you can always just bring your needle to the wrong side of your fabric and you can tie a knot back here. Either way works, just do whatever makes you happy. So I'm just going to tie a little knot. And you don't have to tie a knot any specific way, just tie it in a way that is comfortable to you. So there you go. I have 1/2 of my vertical stitching done, and I am going to thread up with some more Sashiko thread, and I'm going to keep going. All right, so I'm now coming to the end of my vertical stitches. I am just gonna bring my needle down and through to finish out that. And now we can take a look. So this is what you have if you've just done your vertical stitches. And honestly, I think it looks pretty cool like this. So if you did wanna just leave it like this with only vertical stitching, that's awesome. That's totally fine. But here's where you kind of get to play with how you want to add to it. If you want to add some horizontal, some diagonal, it's kind of up to you. I'm going to show you though how to do some horizontal stitching. And I'm also going to be kind of creative with it. So instead of doing horizontal stitching through all of it, I am just going to break it up and do horizontal stitching in like little blocks. So I'm going to do my horizontal stitching in a block from here over. I'm going to use this brighter pen so it's easier to see. I'm going to do my horizontal stitching in a block from like here up through here. And then I'm going to do another block on this side from here up through here. So these 2 blocks will have horizontal stitching. I think that'll give us a really cool checkerboard effect, and I'm interested to just kind of try it out. So when I'm ready to change directions, I am just going to take my needle. You'll notice that I'm still connected to my work. I haven't tied off or anything, and I have plenty of thread to keep working. So if you need to change directions, you don't have to tie off your thread or cut it or back stitch. You can just change directions. Just make sure that your tension stays nice and even. So I'm going to come under my work again. And now to create that really cool like plus sign cross look, I'm going to bring it right here. And I am just actually going to eyeball it. I'm going to eyeball it and bring it about halfway through a block. And I am going to cross it over that vertical line that we have. So it will look like that. I'm going to do a few more so you get more of an idea of what it's supposed to look like. So I am just going to come up here, and to save a little time, I'm going to do our Sashiko method of stitching, where I'm not bringing it all the way down. I am just going to rock it back and forth on the right side of my fabric. Bring it all the way to that line that we drew. So you'll see I'm not really basing it off of any lines I have drawn on my fabric. Instead, I am basing it off of those vertical stitches that we started with. So I'm gonna go ahead, pull that through. I'm gonna do this last one. And you can see that is what a line of those stitches look like. So if that is a look that you're into, I definitely recommend trying it out. You'll see that these little stitches that I have, they aren't based on going off of a line on my grid. Instead, I'm using these vertical stitches that we already did to kind of just go right on top of them, right through the center. So yeah, I encourage you to give that a try, and I am just gonna fill it in. So now that I've just finished right here, I'm gonna hop up to this stitch right here and go across. You'll notice the reason why we staggered our vertical stitches was so that we could go and do these horizontal stitches without having them touch each other. It's really important whenever you're doing your first vertical line in Sashiko to know if you're doing staggered stitches, stitches that are right parallel to each other. Be really careful to note your design and see what your design is telling you to do. And that is going to give you a really nice finished product. If you do mess up while you're doing Sashiko stitching, it's super easy to pull out your stitches. Just undo them. You don't have to worry about any knots or any sort of fancy knot work holding them in. Just, undo them. So as you're doing these horizontal stitches, just make sure to make them pretty even. And also as you go, as you change from row to row, make sure your tension isn't getting too tight. You really want to keep that nice even tension. I think for beginner stitchers, when it comes to Sashiko, the thing you're probably going to struggle with the most is getting that nice even tension so that you don't have any puckers on your fabric and so that your stitches are always pretty straight. I think that's something that everybody kind of struggles with at first. Just take your time, let yourself get used to it. I would definitely recommend stitching on some practice fabric before you go in on a garment, just to get yourself comfortable. I also really recommend, I think this is pretty big, if you are going to be doing Sashiko stitching on a garment, make sure it's a woven one. You do not want to be doing this on a knit garment because the stretchiness of that knit garment, imagine like a t-shirt or a pair of leggings, it's really not going to lend itself well to doing this stitching. Because you can imagine if you are stitching on something that needs to stretch, these stitches aren't very stretchy, so it won't be able to be stretched around your body. So I am going to keep on. I'm just going to do this one last little bit. So yeah, if you do want to stitch on a garment that is maybe a little lighter weight, there are some things you can use to make it a little easier. You can use something that's called a stabilizer. Stabilizer is basically anything that you put behind the fabric or on top of the fabric to add a little bit of body to it. You can get tearaway stabilizers, which are like papery and you tear them away when you're done. You can use water-soluble stabilizers that go away after you wash it, or heat-soluble stabilizers, which go away by heat. Either one is a great option, but that's great if you're working on a really lightweight fabric and you want to give it a little bit of heft. I'm going to lick my needle to make it a little stiffer, or lick my thread, what? So yeah, stabilizer is a great option, but just I wouldn't recommend trying to stitch on anything that has to be stretchy. If you do want to stitch on, let's say, like a knit t-shirt, like just anything that's a regular t-shirt material, you can do that. I would just always use a stabilizer with that t-shirt to give it some body. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to control your tension on that stretchy fabric. So here I am just finishing up these last little bits. I really encourage you to get creative with this. Look up different Sashiko patterns. There are literally tons that range from super easy to really advanced. So whatever your level is at, I really recommend you try new things out. You don't always have to do this on a garment. If you want to do it on just a piece of fabric, make a coaster, make a wall hanging, whatever, you can do that. Sashiko, I know that you may already know this, but if you don't, Sashiko is a great way to repair clothing. So we aren't going over it today, but if you just use it on top of any sort of like rip or hole that you have in any sort of garment, by putting a patch behind it and then doing this kind of stitching on top, that's really going to reinforce that patch and add a whole new life to whatever garment you have that you may have an imperfection in. I think it's a great way to acknowledge that this garment has a history, but you're doing stuff on top of it to make it cool. But today we're just using it as a decorative element. It's a really, really versatile art form, and I encourage you to look up the history and everything you can to find out more about it. So now I'm just finishing up. Needle came unthreaded, so I'm just gonna start it one last time. And I'm going to show you one more time how to finish off your stitches without tying a knot in the traditional Sashiko method. So for that, you'll notice this last stitch that I did right there is a little shorter than all the others. So now I'm going to come just a little beyond it. So we went down right there. So now we're coming up just a few fibers away from where we went down. And I am just going to stitch backwards for a few stitches. It's just like on your sewing machine, making a back stitch to reinforce those stitches, but for this we're doing it by hand. So I'm going to do one more, bring it down. I'm going to bring this to the back. I'm going to use my scissors to snip. And there you have it. Here is a really simple way to jazz up your clothing. These marks will go away when we wipe them away and put an iron on it just to smooth everything out. The iron will get rid of these pink lines, and then smudging it away will get rid of these chalk lines. You can see I kind of played around with doing the design, not on the entire thing, but kind of just having a checkerboard of the little crosses, but I encourage you to use this in so many ways. I did it on the back of a shirt, but you can use it on the sleeves, anywhere that you want. Cool, so now that we've gone over some basic Sashiko stitching, I'm gonna show you how to embellish your clothes using embroidery techniques. So now that we've done the Sashiko stitching on the back of our shirt, we're gonna try doing a little bit of embroidery stitching on the front. So the tools that I have with me today are, I have my hoop. I like using a small 3-inch hoop when it comes to clothing because I think it's a lot easier to move it around and kind of figure it out with the shape of the clothing. We have our tiny little snips. You can use scissors too, but I like using snips. We have our needle. I'm actually using the same size needle that I did for Sashiko, but embroidery needles that are around a size 5 to 7 are gonna be great. You want something that's not too big, but not too small. And then finally we have our thread. I am gonna go with a blue and white to kind of match the style that's on the back, but have fun with it and feel free to use as many colors as you want. We're just gonna be doing 2 simple stitches today. We're gonna be doing the back stitch and we're gonna be doing the French knot. I think those are 2 fun ones to really get you going, but there are tons of stitches out there. There's a great multitude of ones to choose from that you can find on a ton of different websites, so get curious about it. But these are gonna be the basics that we're gonna learn today. So let's get started. I'm gonna start by hooping up the fabric and deciding where I wanna stitch. I think that I just wanna do a fun little design right here in the top center of my project. When you wanna hoop up, you don't wanna hoop so that your fabric is hanging off. Sometimes I think that's a little hard to get your attention. So instead, I like to do a smaller hoop and try to get as close to the edge as possible. So my embroidery hoop that we're using today has 2 separate parts. We have our inner hoop, which is just a plain old circle. We have our outer hoop that has this little screw on the top. So how I'm gonna hoop up my project is I'm gonna put the inner hoop down on the table and I'm just gonna place my outer hoop right on top. You don't wanna try to, and I need to actually loosen mine a little bit more. So you make sure when you're doing this part, especially on clothing, that you're not hooping up any pieces that you don't want. So you can see that I'm just hooping up this front side of the shirt. I'm not hooping up the front and the back together, because if I stitch through both those layers at the same time, I wouldn't be able to get my head through the shirt, which would be no fun for me. So instead, I'm just gonna make sure I get that one layer in. Then from there, I'm gonna just tighten that outer hoop, make it nice and tight and topped. Okay, so once I have my fabric nice and hooped up, I'm ready to start designing. So I really like, when it comes to clothing, figuring out what design I want to do on the project as I go. So looking at this, I think I'm going to do a little sunburst pattern. So I'm going to do just a line and then little dots going in between each line. It's a little hard with the tools that I have, but once I start stitching, you'll see what I mean. So I'm just gonna start by doing a regular back stitch along this line. So something to keep in mind as you are doing embroidery on clothing, especially if you want it to follow a certain section, you're gonna have to move your hoop around a lot if you're using a small one like I do. But if you use a bigger hoop, you're not gonna have to do that as much. But I like doing this better. So I'm gonna grab my thread first before I do anything else. I'm gonna bring the thread to about the length of my arm, which is around 24 inches. It's always important to cut your thread before you do anything with it, because you don't want it to get tangled up on itself. So I'm gonna simply cut it. And now let's look at this thread. So embroidery thread is different than Sashiko thread in that it can pull apart. So if you look at this thread, you'll see that it's actually made of tons of smaller little strands. There's 6 in there, and you can divide them up to be however thick you want. If you want a really, really thin, delicate line, you might use 1 or 2 strands. If you want something that's really thick and chunky and bold, you'll use all 6. Today, I'm gonna use all 6. So I'm not gonna worry about separating it out at all, but if I did wanna separate it out, I would do it at this step. But instead, I'm just gonna go ahead and thread my needle. So I'm gonna get that threaded, and I'm gonna pull it just like I did in Sashiko. I'm gonna pull one side longer than the other. So if you see here, you'll see I have one side that's short, and I have one side that's long. I'm gonna call the short side my tail, and I'm gonna call the long side my working thread. We are gonna tie a knot right at the end of my working thread. It doesn't have to be a fancy knot, just any way you wanna tie a knot is great. So if you just wanna tie a regular old single knot, there you go. You just wanna make sure that your knot is close to the end of your working thread so you don't have a bunch of wasted thread on the other side. So the purpose of this knot is it's gonna keep our thread anchored into our fabric, so it gives us a really steady base to start with. So now that I have my knot tied, my needle threaded, I'm ready to get to work. So if I just wanna do a simple back stitch that goes along the width of my top hem, I'm just gonna start here. To start your back stitch, you're gonna pull up from the back of your fabric, and you're gonna start by doing one single stitch forward. I'm gonna do one single stitch forward, and then you wanna do another stitch. You wanna create the illusion of a solid line when you do the back stitch. So you start by doing your one stitch forward. But if you were to come out right here where my first stitch finished, there would be no fabric fibers for that thread to hold onto, so it would undo my thread. So to stop that from happening, but make it look like the stitches are coming from the same place, I am just gonna hop away the length of one stitch, pull all the way through, and now I am gonna go backwards. And I'm just gonna go and meet that first stitch where it ended. So now I'm gonna meet that first stitch where it ended. I'm gonna pull all the way through. We have the start of our back stitch. We have one forward stitch, one stitch that's going backwards. But now here's where you can do a little trick to save yourself some thread. Instead of going backwards every single time, so by that I mean instead of, hopping away a space here, going back, hopping away a space, going back, to save a little bit of thread, what you can do is, because we just went down right there, we can now come up right here. And now we can go down, do a forward stitch. And so now it's just you do the same thing, so on and so forth. You do one stitch forward, one stitch backwards, one stitch forward, one stitch backwards. The thing to remember with this stitch is consistency. You want all of your stitches to be the same length and meet each other in a really, really nice pattern. And that's it, that's the back stitch. So just keep on stitching. So I'm just gonna keep on stitching. You'll notice that I'm doing every other one is going backwards. And I'm making sure they always are kind of coming up and down from the same point. Something to note as you're stitching and embroidering on clothing, make sure you're only stitching through the layer that you want to be stitching on. Something that could happen super easily and be really frustrating is if this piece got folded under and I stitched through both layers, then my fabric is stuck like that, which is really frustrating because then you have to cut out all of your stitches to get it to lie flat again, and it can affect the wear of the garment or if you can even get into the garment. So I recommend always just going slow and making sure you're stitching exactly what you want to be stitching. So now that I'm at the end of where my hoop is letting me be, I'm going to go ahead and take my fabric out of the hoop and just move it over. And so for myself, I am just going to draw a line of where I want these back stitches to go so that it's super easy to see what I want to be embellishing. You'll see I'm having them just come right along the neckline with an equidistant space away from it. So eventually I will have a really cool line of stitching going all the way down the neckline. As you're changing, your hoop setting, make sure the needle doesn't get pinched in between the layers of the hoop. You want to make sure that it's out of the way for that. If it does get pinched in between the layers, it's fine. You just have to undo your hoop and pull it out. So now I'm just going to tighten up my hoop again. And I'm going to keep the line going. And now because I've drawn this line onto my fabric with the yellow pen, I have a clear idea of where I'm supposed to be going. So again, if you need a little refresher on the stitch and how to do it, I'll show you one more time how it works. We're going to start by doing one stitch forward. So I'm going to come out right here. Oh, my needle fell through. I'm going to come out right here, do one stitch forward, pull all the way through, and now I'm going to hop away the length of a stitch, come out right there, and do one stitch back. Easy peasy. Now just keep on going. So this stitch really creates the illusion of one solid line. It's great for any type of embroidery work where you do want to make something look like a solid line. Let's say you're doing a sketch, a line work, you want to create an image, or you want to do words. Backstitch is great for that. And I'm going to go back later and stitch more, but I want to show you guys how to do the French knot next. So I'm going to show you how to tie off. When you get done with a section and you're ready to tie off and go onto a different part, all you have to do is tie a simple knot on the back side of your fabric. There are tons of different ways to tie knots with your thread when it comes to garment sewing. There are tons. And so I think it really just depends on how you like to do it. I recommend that you look up different methods and find what works best for you. If what works best for you is just tying a regular old knot, do it. That's fine. For me personally, because we are working with garment sewing, I really like to make sure my knot is nice and secure on the back of my fabric. So this is the way that my costuming professor in college told me to tie knots. So what I'm going to do is I am going to take my needle, I'm going to run it underneath a stitch that I've previously done. It doesn't have to be the stitch that we've just done, it just has to be whichever stitch is closest. So I'm going to bring it underneath the closest stitch on the wrong side of the fabric. I'm going to pull it through, but I'm not going to pull it all the way through. I'm just going to pull it partially through. so that there is just enough thread to pinch my fingers through. So I'm gonna bring my thumb and my pointer finger through. And now that I have that, I have one loop that's about as big as my thumb and my pointer finger, like that. So after I have that step, you'll see one side of the loop is the thread coming out of the fabric, and the other side of the loop is the thread being docked by that previous stitch. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna pinch that thread that's coming from the other side of the stitch. I'm gonna just pinch that. After I do that pinch, I'm gonna pull it through. So again, that's, you have your loop, you do a pinch. After you do your pinch, you're gonna pull it through. And now after you pull it through, you're gonna use this bottom side of the second loop to tighten. You're gonna pull on that. You're just gonna tighten that first loop down. Now that I've tightened that first loop down, I just have this one left. I'm gonna bring my needle through it, and I am just gonna pull it through till I have a beautiful knot that is sitting right flush with my fabric. So that knot is gonna be really secure. It's not gonna catch on anything. It's my favorite way to tie knots on garment sewing. So after I have that, I'm just gonna snip it, and we're ready to change colors. So now that I have my back stitch, I'm gonna show you guys how to do a French knot. I think French knots are so fun. They are a great way to embellish anything. You can use them for florals, you can use them as just decorative stitches, you can use them to create texture. The options are endless when it comes to some French knot stitching. So I'm gonna do mine today out of some white thread. So I'm gonna do the same exact thing that we did for our blue thread. I'm gonna pull it the length of one arm like that, and then I'm gonna snip it. After I snip it, I'm gonna go ahead and thread my needle just like normal. So I like to lick it, pinch it, thread it. And now we're doing the same exact thing that we did with our back stitch, where we have one side longer than the other. We have our tail right there, and we have our working thread right here. Tail is shorter, working thread is longer. I'm just gonna tie a knot at the end of the working thread right there. So I'm just gonna use my method of tying a knot to have it nice and close to the end. We're ready to get going. So now I'm gonna do little French knots just going up above this line. I think it'll be really cute to create like almost polka dots on the fabric. So to start it, I'm gonna do what I would normally do. To start a stitch, I'm gonna pull up from the back side and pull all the way through. So you'll see our little knot is anchoring our thread on the back side of our fabric, just like that. After I have that, now is the technical part. So once I have my thread pulled through and it's nice and taut, I'm gonna usually, I think if you're just starting out, it's easier to set this down on a table so you have both hands free to do the stitching. I'm gonna set my fabric down on my table. I'm going to pull my thread to the left because I'm right-handed. If you're left-handed, just do all of this opposite what I'm doing. So I am gonna use my left hand to pull my thread to the left. I'm gonna bring my needle underneath that thread that's coming out of the fabric. I'm gonna do 2 loops around the tip of my needle. You'll notice that I'm using the thread that's close to the needle. I'm using the thread that's close to where it's coming out of the fabric. So I'm just taking my needle, I'm doing 2 loops around the tip of that needle right there. After I have that, I'm going to bring my needle and I'm going to place it in my fabric. I'm not placing it exactly in the same hole that I came out of. The reason for that being, if I went into the same hole I'd just come out of, there would be no fabric fibers to hold onto it. So instead, I'm gonna bring it a few fibers away. I'm gonna bring it down. Now this is a step that I think is a really big make or break when it comes to making your French knot, into making it neat or not neat. The best way to make your French knot neat every single time is now that you have your needle docked in the fabric like that, you're gonna take your thread that's coming out of the little loops, you're gonna tighten it down. So again, I'm gonna loosen it up, If this is our needle just docked in the fabric, to make your French knot neat every single time, you're just gonna take your thread, you're gonna tighten it. So you'll see that you already can kind of visualize the little knot that you're gonna be making because it's nice and tight against the surface of your fabric. So now I'm just gonna take my needle and I am gonna pull it through. And you'll see a beautiful French knot just kind of forms naturally. So that's the French knot, but let's do a couple more to get you the hang of it. So I'm gonna come over again. I'm gonna pull through like we did. Now when you go from French knot to French knot, you don't have to tie off, you don't have to, clip your thread, start again. I just go from stitch to stitch like I would with any normal stitch. I'm gonna take my thread, I'm gonna pull it to the left, bring my needle underneath, do 2 loops around the tip of my needle. I'm gonna put my needle in my fabric. I call this the sword and the stone step because the needle is kind of sticking out of the fabric like the sword and the stone. Maybe I'm just a nerd, but that's the way I think about it. So from there, I'm gonna do our make or break step, which is tightening that little loop. And then I am just gonna pull my needle through. And then from there, we can just keep making them. You can decide how spaced out you want these to be. You can decide how big you want them to be. The more loops you do around the tip of your needle, the bigger your French knot is gonna be. 3 loops, bigger. If you just did 1 little loop, you'd have a tiny knot. So play around with that, making your French knots bigger or smaller. So I'm just gonna keep on going until I can't go no more. And now I'm getting to the point where I have to change over my hoop. Oop. So you'll see this one, so a little troubleshooting thing that happened. You'll see that this one, the knot already formed and it got pulled to the back side of the fabric. The reason for that being I made where I came out and went back into my fabric too close to each other, so there were no fiber pieces of the fabric to actually grip onto that knot. So it just kind of pulled itself through. What you can do when that happens is I typically will just let that exist on the back side of my fabric. I won't try to redo it or anything. So instead I am just gonna unhoop, move it over a little bit, making sure that my fabric and needle isn't caught up in between the layers of the hoop. I'm gonna re-hoop. Okay. And now what I'll do is to get rid of that little knot, I'm just gonna go away double the length that I would wanna go away. So that then that knot is just neatly kind of kept on the back side of our fabric because we don't want it getting in the way of our other stitching. So then I will just do another French knot like normal. Pull that through. And then I'm gonna go back and fill this space in. Hopefully it won't pull through on us again. So I'm gonna make sure it doesn't happen by coming away a few fibers. And hooray, it didn't do it. And then I'm just gonna keep going. And that is the French knot, guys. It's super simple. It's a really simple stitch that looks really cool and technical and creates awesome texture, but you don't have to be a master to know how to do it. So now I'm doing my last little French knot. I'm gonna pull my needle through, and now I'm gonna do another knot on the back in the same way I was doing my knots before. So to give you guys a really good view, I'm gonna come here. So now because we're right up against the edge, you don't have to go against these white stitches that are right there. Instead, I'm gonna come underneath this blue stitch. I'm gonna bring my needle underneath it and through. Now after I have that, I have this little loop I can put my fingers through. I'm just gonna put my fingers through this loop. I'm gonna pinch this thread that's coming out on the other side of where we're going underneath our stitch. I'm gonna pinch, pull through, tighten down, pull our needle through, and we have a knot. It's gonna be super secure and awesome. I'm gonna trim it. All right, so this is just a tiny little tidbit of embroidery. If I had more time, I would embroider this whole neckline going both ways. I might do more French knots to add more texture, and I might do my back stitches in kind of like a wavy pattern. I think that could be cool, but this is just a little tidbit of what it's gonna look like. I encourage you guys to get really creative with it, put it all different places. Some things to know if you are gonna be doing embroidery on clothing, make sure you always have your hoop be the right size for what fits your hands and what's comfortable for you. If you're gonna be stitching on a really, really lightweight piece of fabric, make sure to use some sort of stabilizer. You can get iron-on stabilizer, you can get tearaway, water soluble, whichever works for you. Definitely recommend using some stabilizer on those lightweight fabrics. All right, so that is some very, very basic embroidery, and we just did a tiny little bit of it, but I encourage you guys to get creative with it, do even more. You can cover a whole garment with embroidery if you want, and that's what we did today. If you're interested in more Top Stitch content, feel free to like and subscribe on this YouTube channel. If you have any questions, just throw them in the comments. If you're interested in more sewing content, check out Top Stitch Makers. There is a ton of really cool resources on there and a community full of people that love to create. Happy stitching and have a great day.